So you've updated to iOS 10. It's nice, shiny, new, but how is the performance? So I went back in time, we're taking a trip down memory lane, and I'm going to be running a test on the iPhone 5 all the way back from the glory days of iOS 6 to iOS 7 to iOS 8, iOS 9, and finally the new iOS 10. I want to see how much slower or faster did iOS 10 get comparing it to the very first iOS 6 and everything in between. So this is actually going to be a very specific test. I want to see just how much slower or faster iOS 10 is on the oldest device currently supporting it. Now, I've been preparing for this video for quite some time. I have an iPhone 5 on iOS 6 that I've been saving just for this occasion. And now that iOS 10 is here, 10.0.2 to be exact, we're going to go ahead and see down the line. So back in the good old days, we used to have this thing called slide to unlock. Now we no longer have that on iOS 10. Unfortunately, it's with a click. So to begin this test, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys that the respective firmwares on these devices are in their iOS 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 categories. They're just not the very first or last firmwares. I mean, they're in between 6.0.1, 7.1.2, 8.2, 9.3.5, and 10.0.2. So we're going to begin with a startup test. This is pretty much to see just how long it takes to go ahead and turn these devices on and load all of the basic settings. So while this is powering on, I just want to take a moment to say I love making these kind of videos. They are extremely difficult to make, but so worth it. They put things into perspective. And 5 years ago, we were running iOS 6 with that skeuomorphic design. I miss it so much. And now we've got such a flat, different design. I mean, it's definitely an evolution, but you gotta miss the good old days. So I'm very happy to say that first place goes to iOS 6. That iPhone 5 and iOS 6 is such a gem, followed by iOS 7, which at the time actually seemed kind of slow. Now look at it in second place, followed by iOS 8 in third place, and believe it or not, iOS 9 is faster than iOS 10. That one was the very last one to load. That was very, very surprising for me to learn. But hey, with all of the new features and changes it introduces, it's going to have a lot more to load. So I definitely understand why it would have longer load times. So moving on, we're going to go ahead and do some synchronized app launching and other functions. And with the app switcher, you can see it's definitely getting slower down the line, but it's easier to use on the newer firmwares. Moving on to Control Center, it actually popped up last on iOS 10. There's this lag and delay, which you will notice. Hopefully it'll get better towards the end of iOS 10. Notification Center turned out to be pretty fast in iOS 10, on par with iOS 6. And before I begin launching applications, just want to show you guys my app switcher is completely cleared, and we're going to start with settings. So that one was first on iOS 6, then 7, and pretty much the same on the rest of the devices. I also wanted to make a point to show you closing applications. So it's actually very fast on iOS 10. That one was the first to close the application as the animations were shortened down a little bit. Launching the camera, pretty much first on iOS 10 and followed down the line. So that's a very good win for iOS 10 there. And again, just wanted to show you guys a synchronized closing of the camera application on iOS 9 and on iOS 10. First place, followed by the rest of the devices. So next up, let's try something a little bit more web-based. iOS 6 was first for weather and followed down the line. Next up, the App Store. This one is notorious for taking forever on newer devices. iOS 7 loaded it first, followed by iOS 6, and then again down the line. So same thing with the iTunes Store. I know we don't open this one often, but iOS 6 did load that one the first again, followed down the line with iOS 8 in last place. Now let's try some fundamentals, starting with the messages. iOS 6 was first and iOS 10 was last here. Phone application, same deal. iOS 10 was in one of the last places with iOS 6 loading it instantly. Same thing again with the music. iOS 10 seems to load that one really slow. And that's something I open multiple times a day. So let's try something, something else, something like Instagram. We're going to be using this one on a daily basis. iOS 7 loaded it first, and iOS 6 version was last. And with Reddit.com preloaded in Safari, iOS 6 did display it first, but iOS 9 actually loaded the completed web page first. iOS 10 was in last place. So the performance of Safari does go down with time, although the HTML5 compatibility of Safari browser with time does go up on the newer firmwares. And next up, I ran a Wi-Fi speed test, same distance from the router. iOS 6 is actually the highest with iOS 10 in one of the lowest scores. This is actually completely maxing out the download speed. Next up, of course, how can I miss it? Geekbench. with 3 running on the older devices that don't support the newer 4, but overall, scores are pretty consistent, although on iOS 10, the low multi-core score does worry me. I don't understand why it was so low, but it did have the second highest single-core score, which matters more in day-to-day usage. And I did follow up the Geekbench with an Antutu benchmark, so on all of these devices, I did run them, and while that was running, I was very interested to see how the temperature of the phones were affected with the software updates. So I did go ahead and measure on the hottest point of the phone while charging and running an intensive benchmark, with iOS 6 running decently in the middle. iOS 7 seems to be the coolest. Pretty good results there. In general, Antutu did get better with time. It was like a ladder up. So iOS 5 was the slowest, and iOS 10 seemed to be the most optimized. Now this measures graphics, CPU, everything all in one. Now this next portion is for Siri and response time. What is the capital of Oregon? iOS 6 is abysmally slow when it comes to getting responses from Siri. Would not want to be using that on a daily basis. What is 10 times 10?
The answer is 100. Let me check that. The answer is 100.
So Siri is actually surprisingly very well optimized on iOS 10. Response times are great. And guys, there it is. That's a test I've been waiting to run for a very long time. The iPhone 5 years apart, wasn't all too bad. iOS 10 is actually very good when it comes to a lot of areas. It's just some of the other smaller stuff like starting up, launching some applications is slower on iOS 10, but in general, usability wise, not bad at all. I want to thank you guys for watching. Leave me a like down below if you think I deserve it. It was not an easy video to make, and stay tuned for more content. Peace.